for example. Well, this may seem like it's coming out of left field, but I feel compelled to mention it because perhaps in late December, it would have been seen as extraordinary to suggest that a crew of special forces would land in Caracas in the middle of the night and kidnap the president and first lady and bring them back to Manhattan to stand trial. But in fact, that happened. And so once again, I've noticed in the US press that there's reference to a failure of imagination. The last time we saw that phrase being invoked, it was on September 11, 2001, in its aftermath, when many felt that it was a failure of imagination for the US authorities to miss the reality that those with whom they had shared a trench in West Asia, speaking of these so-called fundamentalists, would be accused of hijacking airplanes and driving them into the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, leading to the deaths of thousands. So with that preface, let me bring up another perhaps extraordinary development. I hope people don't think I'm some sort of crank by laying this on the table, but by laying it on the table, hopefully I'll, as they used to say in the streets, peep the whole card of the Trumpistas in Washington. What I mean is, I think we should take seriously this confrontation with Denmark, a nation of a mere 6 million, in Greenland, where Mr. Trump was threatening invasion of Greenland minimally. And of course, one could not rule out the necessary confrontation with the Danes themselves. And then I noticed that he sent this angry message to the Norwegians because he did not get the Nobel Peace Prize. He ascribed that to the government in Oslo more so than the Peace Prize Committee. And then I began to try to connect the dots. And I'd look at Norway, a country of a mere 4 million, with a sovereign wealth fund of over $1 trillion, with that sovereign wealth fund invested in virtually every major corporation on planet Earth. I think that many of the so-called European allies are engaged in a failure of imagination because they are so seized with the idea of Russia that they should be looking across the Atlantic at the United States, because I'm sure that in the Pentagon, there are probably combat plans and war plans to invade a country like Oslo, which has a country like Norway, which has a small population, and this, to repeat, a sovereign wealth fund of over $1 trillion. But before we get there, I'd also raised another disturbing prospect. You know, at the White House today, February 3rd, there's supposed to be an appearance by President Petro of Colombia. He and Mr. Trump have been exchanging insults until a phone call just a few days ago. And given Mr. Trump's history as a television star who obviously admires suspense and drama, I had warned Mr. Petro and his allies that they might want to reconsider coming to Washington in light of the kidnapping of President Maduro and Celia Flores, that it would not surprise me at all if Mr. Petro was detained upon landing in Washington and bundled off to the Southern District of New York, perhaps to share a jail cell adjacent to that of Mr. Maduro. Now, please excuse me if there are those in your audience who feel that this is coming out of left field, but Mr. Trump has obviously broke the norms and broke the rules. And so we should not let a failure of imagination to manacle us and handcuff us and prevent us from bringing forward these kinds of scenarios that, quite frankly, I'm sure are part of the alpha and omega of Pentagon work plans as we speak.
So let me at the very beginning that one of my concerns now or interest is experience and the chest. Would you comment on that?
Well, I'm not sure if I heard the complete answer, but I will try to respond cogently. Today, February 3rd, 2026, the temporary protective status of thousands of Haitians is slated to be removed. They are slated to be sent back to the island, which is now undergoing turmoil. I think that we should be ultra concerned with this turn of events, not least because the Haitian Revolution, as already noted and is represented in my book, Confronting Black Jacobins, had so much to do with the abolition of slavery in this country. We owe an unpayable debt to Haiti for where we are today. And so to turn our backs on the thousands of Haitians who were defamed and slandered by Mr. Trump during the fall 2024 debate with Vice President Kamala Harris, arguing that they were eating the cats and dogs of their neighbors. Sadly and quite troubling is the reality that many, I'm afraid to say, in the Buckeye state of Ohio, probably accepted those lies and propaganda. This is no way to treat individuals, just like Mr. Trump has repeatedly slandered and insulted and defamed the Somali population of Minneapolis. In fact, that's going to be one of the points that I raised on Friday at Macalester College, because I was just making reference to the downside, if you like, of the Cold War and the Red Scare, the policy of the United States post-1945. The Red Scare and the Cold War also afflicted East Africa. That is to say, at a certain point in the 1970s in particular, Somalia was on a progressive route of development. But alas, it was enticed and induced by Washington, and of course, some of the ideological weaknesses of its leaders, to invade neighboring Ethiopia after Ethiopia had dislodged His Imperial Majesty Haile Selassie and had brought to power in Addis Ababa a military regime known as the Derg, D-E-R-G-U-E. Therein one begins to see the spiraling downward of Somalia, not least because of following the advice of Washington, for example, because Somalia at that point was no match for Ethiopia. Ethiopia, of course, is the second most populous nation on the African continent, second to Nigeria. Ethiopia also, over the decades, has had in its arsenal a very competent number of airline pilots. Ethiopian Airways is probably the leading carrier on the African continent. Some of your audience might know that this is due in no small measure to the fact that in the 1930s, you had Black American pilots, particularly from Chicago. I'm speaking of John Robinson from Chicago via Gulfport, Mississippi, who came to Ethiopia's defense during the Italian invasion of the 1930s, became the personal pilot of His Imperial Majesty Haile Selassie, and of course stayed on in Addis Ababa. And when he died in 1954, there was a massive funeral procession in his honor. I say all that to say that Ethiopia has developed a core of talented pilots, and therefore Somalia was no match. Somalia was sent downward in a spiral, creating refugees, not least in Kenya. Many of those refugees wound up in the Twin Cities, where they're now being defamed by Mr. Trump, like he defamed Haitians, called garbage. It's led to assaults on your Congresswoman, Ilhan Omar, as recently as a few days ago. And once again, I think it's important to recognize that we should look at what's happening in the Twin Cities in context. It's not a thing in itself. It's not something that you can isolate and just say that this is unique and peculiar to the Twin Cities. It's something with national implications, it's something with global implications. And just as what happened in East Africa wound up having repercussions and ramifications in Minnesota, we need to realize that we are in the midst of a global village, and that is short-sighted at best to imagine that Black Americans can escape. That is to say, that if tensions continue to be ratcheted up with China, for example, leading, heaven forbid, to some sort of nuclear exchange, it's not as if there's a nuclear bomb that's going to not hit Black people in the United States of America. It will hit everybody here, which means that all of us need to be concerned. All of us need to be active. All of us need to be protesting.
So that's why, Dr. Horne, I raised the question about Burkina Faso. And there seems to be a spirit of hope among the young people of Africa. I'm not sure if that has reached African Americans yet, but in the people I'm talking to, there is an aspiration being expressed in the sort of voice of sovereignty and the voice of eliminating or reducing colonial extraction as a policy and self-reliance of growing and developing what is not used at more of fair trade versus the exploitative relationship that has existed. What do you see in that regard? Is that happening, or is that wishful thinking?
It's not wishful thinking at all. I mean, some of the most encouraging events on planet Earth right now are precisely occurring in the Sahel, in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. You may have seen the rapturous welcome that Ibrahim Traore of Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso, received when he attended the inauguration some months ago of incoming Ghanaian President John Mahama, for example. And I think that this is encouraging because we need to recognize that though there are about 8 billion people on planet Earth, events in one corner of this small planet inevitably has ramifications in other corners. And certainly with regard to people of African descent, as noted in my previous remarks and as noted in a number of books by myself and others, our fate historically has been tied to the fate and destiny of Black people in Haiti, as noted, as Black people on the African continent. I just cited examples about Howard University that you may recall. And so when you see the government of Niger in particular, which is seeking and has sought successfully higher payments for its most precious exports, speaking of uranium, which are used in France to power nuclear plants that supply Paris with electricity, these payments that have been increased under the new government in Niger, in Niamey, are going to extend and improve the life chances of the Nigerian masses. Now, to be sure, there is staunch opposition to these progressive developments in the Sahel. That is to say, you may recall that when the Niger regime came to power just some months ago, that neighboring Nigeria had threatened to invade. You probably know that President Tinubu of Abuja, Nigeria, used to live in the United States. Apparently, he fled Chicago with charges hanging over his head, and those charges were dangled in his face when he was threatened by the U.S. State Department to invade neighboring Niger in order to dislodge this progressive regime. Fortunately, Nigerian parliamentarians objected, and therefore his hand was stayed. You might have also noticed that there was almost a change of government in Benin, another Nigerian neighbor. Hopefully that attempted change of regime would have been along the lines of trends in Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali. but we'll never know because it was squashed and squelched by the Nigerian military. All of us have a stake in these developments. When Mr. Trump bombed Nigeria right on Christmas Day, 2025, supposedly because he was attempting to squash what he called a genocide against Christians, we should see that for the poppycock and the balderdash that it is. Sadly and unfortunately, there are those in our community, such as the pop star Nicki Minaj, who have not been convinced. Now, I understand she has some legal problems with Washington, and her snuggling up to Mr. Trump has everything to do with the legal problems that she and those close to her are enduring. But what Nicki Minaj needs to recognize is that she might be cutting a positive deal for herself and her loved ones, but she's leaving the rest of us in the ditch. And I dare say that those who counsel us to steer clear of international trends and international developments and stick solely to our domestic knitting, they are de facto versions of Nicki Minaj, whether they recognize it or not.
Telephone, and I'm trying to connect with the telephone as a backup here. So I can see you now. Do you see me? And I'm not sure if you hear me.
I do.
Okay, you hear me. So listen, we've only got about 5 minutes to go. This has been a wonderful conversation. Again, I apologize, but I'm also amazed at the technology that I was able to do a backup in a second on my telephone away from my desktop. And I want to remind people to show up this Friday at McAllister College for the Mahmoud El-Kati lecture. It's going to be a wonderful event. Dr. Horne, let me again drill back to, I'm just so fascinated by Burkina Faso, particularly the voices that I've heard from Captain Ibrahim Traore. One thing I keep hearing from him is a different understanding of a key word in our history, our civil rights history, integration. He speaks of integration differently. And to me, it's elevating something we know and we've experienced to its natural and logical conclusion. Integration for Ibrahim Traore means integrating African states, the 54 states in the African continent, into a single unit of governance and organization. And that integration, as I understand him, ought to include a way to integrate the entire diaspora into an ecosystem, a political system, a cultural understanding, and a way to build a future that elevates and celebrates African life all over the planet, not to the exclusion or detriment of other formations of governance and culture, but in ways that certainly enable us to defend and project our potential for ourselves and for the future. Does that make sense to you?
Well, obviously it makes sense. In fact, it's been exemplified. You may recall it was just a few months ago in late 2025 that you had an important summit in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, between the African Union, the Pan-African Trans Body, 4 dozen plus African nations, and the Caribbean community, CARICOM, led by Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad, etc. One of the agenda items was reparations to the descendants of enslaved Africans. That is to say, our ancestors never got paid for the work that they've done, even though historically the enslavers were compensated when slavery was abolished. At least that was the case in the British Empire, to an extent that also befell Haiti when they were forced to pay a massive indemnity, as it was called euphemistically, to the former enslavers in France. In the United States, the enslavers in Washington, D.C., for example, received reparations, not the descendants of the enslaved. With regard to the remarks, the insightful remarks of Mr. Traore, what he is reflecting on, I dare say, is the development of the African Continental Free Trade Association, which once again is seeking to create something akin to the European Union. for example, I noticed with interest that in today's Financial Times of London, Mario Draghi, who is the former leader of the central bank of the European Union, says the EU really needs to move towards federation.
Yeah.
That's to say, move towards one nation. That's the only way that small countries like Norway and Denmark, for example, can stand up to Washington, a nation of 343 million, is if they pool their strength and pool their capabilities with France, with Britain, with Italy, for example. And likewise, Africa, 4 dozen plus, perhaps 54 different nations, can pool their strengths and capabilities, and the scaffolding is already there with the African Continental Free Trade Organization, with the African Union headquartered in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. I think that is the future. And what was missing in Addis Ababa for that reparations summit with CARICOM and the African Union was a sizable delegation from Black America. Because again, I think that there are too many in our community who somehow are just seized with events in the four corners of this nation, even though the right wing dominates this nation, and even though that goes against the grain and goes against the trajectory of our history.
I think we are blessed and appreciative. Thank you so much. I'm Al McFarlane. We'll see you next time. Take care.